Hey there, my name is Sjofors, and I'm also known as the Price Whisperer. Yeah, I got a weird Swedish name, and because of that, I decided to use that moniker, the Price Whisperer, instead. Anyway, I'm here to talk about different kinds of methodologies you can use in your pricing research, in your pricing strategy research, to measure willingness to pay. And it's obviously crucial in a pricing research project to understand what willingness to pay is, what your customers are willing to pay for your product or your service, right? It's kind of goes without saying. Now, there essentially, at least to my knowledge, there are three methodologies here that are in wide use. The first is called Conjoint Analysis, and there's several versions of that, and choice-based and adaptive and so forth. And then we have this Peter van Westendorp's price sensitivity meter, and there is something also called Gabor Granger, and then in my company, we developed our own because we found that none of these were good enough. We found that they weren't precise enough, and we just had to do something better. And that's something that we called predictive sales analysis. And but if we look at each of these one by one. And by the way, in the pricing research projects, we often use more than one method. We often use conjoint together with our own predictive sales analysis. And the interesting thing is that they then sort of both becomes a quality control for the other method. And they have consistently always showed very similar results, but conjoint is not, the error rate is too high and it's not really precise enough. Anyway, so if we look at these three and compare them with predictive sales analysis, in conjoint, the whole idea, of course, is to be presented with bundles. You have typically 5 or so attributes, and each of the attributes have 4 or 5 variables. And one of the attributes, obviously, is price, and then there are different price suggestions. And what happened in a conjoint is that these are being presented to the respondents as a bunch of bundles, and the respondent to a survey is supposed to look at these bundles that has has different variables for the different attributes, and select the bundle that is most likely they would buy, right? And once they've done that selection, they're being presented with another set of bundles where the combination of variables to the attributes are different. The attribute stays the same, but the variables change. And now they're supposed to make a choice of these new bundles. Herein lies one of the problems with conjoint. It becomes very repetitive, right? So you're supposed to have then a respondent who have some level of domain knowledge in the survey, and that consistently need to read through every bundle, or if images are used, look at the images in the various bundles and make a concerted effort. Now, you do that 3-4 times, right? Then many respondents say, "Oh, this is too much work. I'll just randomly click somewhere to get on with the survey." And obviously, it's often you are being presented with these variables and these attributes 12 times, 15 times, 18 times, depends on how many they are, and it's too much. We as humans can't make that many proper decisions in a short period of time, especially as these variables often are very they're very, how should I say, they're closely related, so it requires the respondents to really think through what they mean. So that it's so repetitive is one problem. Another problem is that conjoint the descriptions of the attributes and the descriptions of the variables have to be very short. I mean, a handful of words, right? And that makes it very hard for anybody to really understand the differences between different variables, what impact it may have on the decision-making process, and so forth. But there's one attribute and one variable that is very, very easy to understand, and that's the price. And as a result of this, conjoint typically overestimate the importance of price compared to the importance of value messages and features and so forth, because those value messages, those features are often too short, right? And doesn't allow the respondent to really make a serious attempt to understand what they mean. So then the I guess the last issue with conjoint is that because it all, these variables are set in stone by the survey designer. If these variables are wrong, then they're not going to point to even close to the right answer. I mean, for example, if the price ranges are outside of what the willingness to pay is, you're not going to get an answer from a conjoint analysis. Then the other thing that conjoint also do not identify psychological price points and so forth, and so there's a lot of problems with conjoint, and yet it's supposed to be the gold standard, but I don't believe that at all. It's also an issue in that you need certain expertise to interpret it and so forth. But there is a way that conjoint can be really very useful, and that is in cross-price elasticity. What is cross-price elasticity? Well, sometimes it's called market simulation. Bottom line, what it is that in a cross-price elasticity study, it's possible to see how potential buyers of a product or a service migrate between different brands based on the prices of these brands. And companies can use that to making sure they cannibalize their competitors more than they can cannibalize themselves, so to speak, when they bring out a new product or a service. So anyway, that was Conjoint. The next one I want to talk about is Garborg Granger, and the idea with Garborg Granger is really great. The respondent is being presented with a description of a product or a service, and then a question: would you buy it for this price? And if depending on whether the price is yes or no, the respondent is again presented with a different price. Would you buy it for this price? Yes or no? And again, this is an interesting way of doing it. The problem here is twofold. Just like with Conjoint, it becomes very, very repetitive, right? And again, after being asked that same question, 4 or 5 times, many respondents simply just click randomly just to move forward in the survey. The other problem is that it doesn't really correlate different variables, different marketing messages or value statements with price. It's just price. And anyone who knows my teaching knows that pricing doesn't live in a vacuum, and that everything you do in your company affects how you can price, right? So that's another issue. So it has a high error rate, basically, just like Conjoint, and it doesn't identify these price walls. The Van Westendorp price sensitivity meter it's getting better, to be honest. And what it does is that it asks people, to suggest a price that they think is too low or too high, and just about obtainable and so forth. The issue with the Van Westendorp is that the descriptions here are often very, very short, and it doesn't in several of the studies I've seen where it's been used, it simply doesn't include a value statement that is good enough. And then when it comes to the analysis, what you get is a chart with lines crossing up and down, and you get 4 different pricing recommendations. Which one are you going to use? I mean, that's very, very confusing, right? Then the method that we have developed, predictive sales analytics, is how should I say it is also unaided. So what we do is that we describe a product or a service in great detail, and again we ask what people are willing to pay for it, when they think it's too expensive, what price they think is too cheap, and so forth. And then we feed that into AI software that we developed, and from that AI software we get 3 price points, right? We get the price that generates the highest sales volume, we get the price that generates the highest revenue, and those 2 are never the same. And in many cases there can be 2 revenue peaks where the highest revenue peak have a fairly low sales volume and therefore is the most profitable revenue peak. And the same with profitability. So the price that generates the highest sales volume, the price that generates the highest revenue, and the price that generates the highest profitability. And we also identify these price walls. Price walls are psychological price points where small price changes significantly affect sales volume and revenue. And if the product is, to start off with, priced way too low, then crossing a price wall means an increase in sales. If it's priced somewhat high, crossing a price wall means a decrease in sales, and revenue. But the beauty with the predictive sales analysis is that you can choose between focusing pricing on sales volume, which you sometimes want because you want to take advantage of the network effect, or you can focus on profitability because you're going to get more resources in your company for more market development, even more product development, more marketing, even hire better, more expensive people in your company. So it's a level of insights that none of the other methods to measure willingness to pay has, right? And that's why it works so great, Anyway, hope you found this of some interest. If you want to learn more about this, I have my book. You can just Google The Price Whisper, and you're going to find it anywhere where books are being sold, online, in brick and mortar stores and so forth. And obviously the book goes into much more details of the topic here. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to see you on the next video. Thanks.